So I'm going to show you how to use a wiggle expression in After Effects. Applying the wiggle expression is a good introduction to expressions in After Effects. I'm not going to go too much into that in this course, but I think they're a really good introduction to how you can write expressions. There's also a wiggler tool here. If you go into Window Wiggler, and we'll look at that in the next video. That's another way we can apply wiggle. But I'm just going to show you how to write the expression yourself. So here I've got just a green square. And I've just opened scale and rotation. I can obviously do wiggle on position, scale, rotation, or opacity, but let's just look at them one at a time. What if I go position first? I'm going to option click in position. Option click on the stopwatch there. Then I type wiggle, open brackets, and then I'm going to type two numbers with a comma in between them. Let's just start with 10, 10. That's a good number to start with. And now think of these two numbers as time and space is a good way to remember what they mean. So the first one is the frequency and the second one is the value. So in the case of position, it's how many pixels it's going to move in X and Y. So let's just now press play. You'll see the green square is moving a tiny bit and it's moving quite fast. What if I wanted it to move slower and move a greater distance? I change the first number down. Let's go down, take it down to 1, and I'll put this up to 100. So it's now 1, 100. Let's look at that. So it's moving more but slower. Okay, so now I'm just going to option click to turn the wiggle off on position. Now I'm going to option click on the stopwatch of scale. Again, I'm going to type wiggle 10, 10. Let's see what that does. It's altering the scale again quite fast and quite small. What if I wanted that to be smaller? I could go 10, 100. See what that looks like. Doing that. Let's try it with rotation. Option click on the stopwatch, wiggle, wiggle. This time I'm going to go 10, now this next number is going to be degrees, right? So if I did 360, that's going to be a complete 360 degree rotation. Let's have a look at that and see what happens. That's going pretty crazy. So let's slow it down again. I'm going to go down to, last time I tried 2. Oh, whoops, sorry, that wasn't 2, that was 12. 2. Now what if I moved the anchor point now with the pan behind tool and put it somewhere else? Like there. So obviously it's going to rotate around that. Pretty quick. It's moving quite fast, but kind of like it. Alright, now what if I duplicated that layer? Command D. I'm going to get two shapes. I'll just change the color of this second one. I'm going to get two shapes doing very different things, right? I can move this second one. Decide I want to put it more over there. Let's do it again. I'll do another one. Let's change the color again. And now obviously I can come in here and edit the rotation. If I wanted to change that, I just open up rotation and go, well, the 360 is a bit full on. I'll put it down to 200 degrees, less than a full rotation. So I can just completely edit that. The orange one is rotating a little bit less than the other ones. Cool. Add another one. Now you can see it, because they're moving so fast across the screen, it's quite the image is quite flickery. The frame rate isn't quite handling the fast movement, as would be the case in a film camera. So how do I make this look a little bit more sort of like we're used to seeing in a moving image camera? The answer would be to put some sort of motion blur on there. So when things move fast across the screen in a movie camera, they would create motion blur. So I can just add that to these layers in this column here. There's a kind of forces a certain amount of motion blur. You'll notice that the RAM preview is slowed right down now. That's okay. I can also add motion blur as an effect, and I can control the amount of motion blur, but I'm just going to do the blanket version there. Another thing I can do to create randomized movement is to use the Wiggler, which is a tool we can find under the Windows menu here. If I open that one up. Here I have a green square again. This time I'm going to put some keyframes in first before I apply a wiggle. Unlike the expression method, which you don't need keyframes for. By the way, you can apply keyframes on top of a wiggle expression, which is also handy. So here I go, apply a keyframe here. I'm going to put another keyframe in here. Just move from there to there, so it's a bit of random movement. Now, if I select both those keyframes by clicking on position here, so I've basically selected all position keyframes. Now, the Wiggler in the Wiggler, you see I can apply frequency and magnitude, which are the same as the first two numbers we used in the wiggle expression. Think of the first one as time, the second one as space. That's how I remember it. Frequency, I'm going to go 10 and 10 again. That's a good place to start. Apply. See, it's created keyframe. It's created a bunch of keyframes. If I zoom in there, it's created a little crazy little motion path, which I can now go in and edit if I wanted to. See, I can move that motion path. So unlike the wiggle expression, I get a motion path, which depending on the job you're doing and what you're trying to do, could be more useful for you. Let's see if I can edit this now. Again, I'll select all keyframes. I'll change the magnitude by a factor of 10 up to 100 and apply. You'll see that motion path's gotten bigger. Can I slow it down though? Frequency, I'm going to put it down to 1. See, this is where I find the Wiggler not as useful, because now I want to slow it down, but I have to actually delete all those keyframes and return them to normal linear keyframes and then reapply. So I find that a bit clunky, but it does work. The cool thing about that is I can now grab those keyframes using the Option key and say I want my wiggle expression to just happen at this point in time, right? Another thing I can also do with the Wiggler is apply 2 keyframes that don't change. So I've got a keyframe now, I'm just going to hit another keyframe. Those keyframes have exactly the same value. I haven't done any movement, so there's no movement there. But I can still apply the wiggle expression to that. And now it's going to wander around like that, similar to as it would if I applied an expression. I can of course apply the Wiggler to scale, rotation and opacity as well. So try out both of those methods. Something you might find useful is to create flickering light is an interesting application. Here I've done a candle with some sort of glowing layers which have a wiggle expression on scale, but I can also apply it to opacity on there. So I could go Option wiggle 10, 10, and you see now that's flickering. So everything that you see is all the flickers you see are done with scale and opacity. So a wiggle expression on those two parameters for those layers. Now the flame is done with let's just find that layer, there it is. If I go to my effects controls, I've got a glow on the flame. Just applied a glow expression, sorry, a glow effect, and I've also got a wave warp, which we'll look at in another little tutorial. But it's really just an effect I've applied. You can just go into your effects and presets, find the wave. If I turn that off, you'll see the candle is really just a teardrop shape layer drawn here in After Effects. I didn't bring any artwork in, and those effects applied to it. But that's a good application where you could use a wiggle expression.